Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why sometimes a simple word like some can make your brain do extra work, while other times, like with not all, it feels different? Well, this new study dives deep into that puzzle. Imagine you hear someone say some of the bottles are full. Your brain might automatically think, okay, so they mean some, but not all. That little extra thought is called a scalar implicature. Now, researchers have a cool idea called the Polarity Hypothesis. It suggests that whether this extra thinking takes effort depends on the word used. For positive words like some, it is thought to be slower, but for negative ones like not all, it is supposed to be quicker. They tested this out with a big experiment. Let's talk about those scalar implicatures. When you hear something like some of the bottles are full, that is where the real mind-bending fun begins. Logically, some means one or more, including the possibility of all. But in everyday chat, we often use some to imply some, but definitely not all. This comes from a principle called the Cooperative Principle. Basically, if someone could have said something more specific, like all the bottles are full, and they didn't, we infer they must have meant the stronger statement wasn't true. So, some really means only some. This inference is called a scalar implicature for a long time. Studies showed it takes more brain power to do this extra pragmatic step compared to just taking the sentence literally. This brings us to the Polarity Hypothesis. It is a newer idea that thinks the difficulty of these scalar implicatures depends on whether the word is positive or negative. Think of scales like some leading to all as positive. The hypothesis says understanding the some but not all part from some might be slower because we're dealing with a positive word. But on a negative scale like not all and none, the opposite might happen. Maybe processing not all to mean not all, but some is faster or at least not slower than the literal meaning. The idea behind this is kind of like how we process negation in general. Positive statements are usually faster to get, while adding not can add a little extra work. So if a positive sentence like some leads to a negative sounding implicature, not all, that might take longer. Conversely, if a negative sentence like not all implies something more positive. Maybe the literal meaning involving negation is the slower part. This hypothesis tries to explain why sometimes we see that slowdown, the B&N effect, and sometimes we don't. Now, other researchers have looked into this before. Some studies found results that fit the polarity hypothesis, suggesting that negative scales don't show the same slowdown as positive ones. For example, some experiments with scales like scarce and absence didn't find the expected processing slowdown, but it is not all clear-cut. Other studies have found mixed results, or results that seem to contradict the hypothesis. For instance, some research showed the slowdown for both positive and negative scales, while other studies found no clear evidence for any slowdown on either. Table 1 gives a summary of all these previous findings showing how different studies measured things like the B&N effect for positive and negative scalars, and the overall polarity hypothesis effect. It's a bit of a mixed bag, which is exactly why the authors of this paper wanted to do their own big experiment to try and get a clearer picture. So the researchers here decided to run a large experiment with over 500 people. Their goal was to really put the polarity hypothesis to the test, making sure their experiment had all the right ingredients. They wanted to compare positive and explicitly negative polarities for weak scalar terms like some versus not all. They also made sure to separate the time it took to read the sentence from the time it took to verify it against the picture. And with a sample size of 538 participants, they had a good shot at detecting even small effects, if they were there. They used a sentence-picture verification task. Basically, people looked at the sentence and then a picture and had to say if the sentence matched the picture. They used 4 pairs of scales, for example, a quantity scale pair with some and all on the positive side and not all and none on the negative side. They also had scales for possibility, time, and space, all with positive and negative counterparts. For each scale pair, they had 3 pictures. One picture would show 0% of something, another 50%. And another 100%. They then created sentences using the weak and strong terms from each scale, like some of the apples are red or all of the apples are red. They also had the negative versions like not all of the apples are red and none of the apples are red. The clever part was how they set up the trials. Some were control trials where it was super clear if the sentence matched the picture, but the critical trials were the ones where the sentence was under-informative, creating that ambiguity we talked about. For example, if the picture showed 50% of the apples were red, the sentence, some of the apples are red, could be interpreted as true because some is literally true, or false pragmatically because some, but not all would be false if all were red, and pragmatically we might infer that stronger meaning. They wanted to see how long it took people to respond in these critical situations compared to the clear. Cut control situations. The experiment was done online through Prolific. Participants saw a prompt to continue, then a sentence, and then a picture. They had to press good or bad to indicate if the sentence matched the picture, and their response time was recorded. They didn't get any feedback on their answers. They started with over 500 people, but removed anyone who made too many mistakes on the easy control trials. They also removed responses that were super fast, like less than 200 milliseconds, because those are probably just accidental button presses. They used some fancy statistical models to look at the data. The main goal was to see if there was a three-way interaction between the response they gave good or bad, the polarity of the word positive or negative, and the condition critical or control. This three-way interaction is what the polarity hypothesis predicts. They also looked at a few other things like the basic B&N effect, which is the general slowdown for pragmatic interpretations. First, they looked at how many good responses people gave. They found that for the critical, ambiguous trials, the good rate was somewhere between the clearly good and clearly bad control trials. This makes sense because with ambiguity, people might sometimes say good and sometimes bad. But the interesting part for the polarity hypothesis came from the response times. Here is the big finding from their own experiment. They did not find clear evidence for the polarity hypothesis when looking at all the data together. The three-way interaction, which would support the hypothesis, was numerically in the right direction, but the statistics showed it wasn't clear enough to be sure it wasn't just a fluke. The results for the B&N effect were also puzzling. Usually, pragmatic interpretations, like some but not all, are slower, but in this study, they didn't find an overall B&N effect across all trials. This is where it gets really interesting. When the trials happened in the experiment, they found something. The classic B&N effect, where pragmatic answers are slower, was present, but only in the early trials. As the experiment went on, this effect seemed to disappear. This suggests that maybe people get a bit tired or their attention wanes. And this affects how quickly they process things. It means the traditional assumption of a slowdown for pragmatic meanings might only be true at the beginning of an experiment. So, their own experiment didn't strongly support the polarity hypothesis on its own, but they did something smart. They combined their results with all the previous studies on this topic in a meta-analysis. This is like pooling all the evidence together to get a bigger picture. And when they did that, the story changed a little. The meta-analysis showed that, overall, there is some evidence supporting the polarity hypothesis. It suggests that polarity does play a role in how we process these implicatures, but the effect isn't super strong and can vary a lot depending on the specific words used and how the experiment is set up. What does all this mean? In their own large experiment, the researchers didn't find solid proof for the polarity hypothesis. The results were mixed, with some scales showing effects and others not. They also found that the classic slowdown for pragmatic meanings, the B&N effect, only showed up early in the experiment. But when they looked at all the studies together, the meta-analysis did suggest there is a real, though perhaps small, effect of polarity on how we process these language puzzles. So, the polarity hypothesis seems to be partially vindicated by the combined evidence, but it is not a slam dunk. Polarity likely influences how much mental effort we put into understanding language, especially when words have different polarities. However, this effect isn't uniform. It can change depending on the specific words used and the way the experiment is designed. The fact that the B&N effect, a general slowdown for pragmatic meanings, seemed to disappear in later trials is also a key takeaway. It highlights how sensitive these cognitive effects can be to factors like fatigue, so while we might not have a perfectly clear answer, the research suggests that the words we use and their inherent positive or negative leanings subtly shape the way our brains process meaning. It is a complex dance between logic and everyday communication, and researchers are still figuring out all the steps. This study is a great example of how science builds on itself. Their own experiment didn't give a definitive answer, but by combining it with previous work, they were able to draw a more robust conclusion. It shows that even when individual studies have mixed results, the scientific process of gathering and analyzing evidence can still lead us forward. What do you think? Did you find this explanation of scalar implicatures and the polarity hypothesis interesting? Does the idea of polarity affecting processing speed make sense to you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into psycholinguistics, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more fascinating research explained simply. We'll see you next time.